Welcome everybody to our second GeoSeminar of the year and of this first season of the GeoSeminars of GeoLatinas. And we have a special invite today who is Esteban Ramos, and he's going to talk about the data-driven modeling of wave energy flux along continental shelves. And well, we are happy to have him here and that he accepted our invitation to be in the GeoSeminars. As you see here, we have already all the season one with different topics that you can assist and check via Facebook. If you want to know more about it, you can check out our GeoLatinas Facebook page and follow us. And I will give a bit of introduction to our speaker today. He's Esteban Ramos Chavarriaga, and he is an applied physicist with a master's degree in earth sciences. He is currently a researcher in the hydrology of the Northern Andes and the biodiversity, evolution and conservation research groups at EAFIT University in Medellin, Colombia. He works with data-driven modeling in natural dynamical systems, environmental science and management, and atmospheric transport and ecosystem exposure. So now we give the mics to you, Esteban. Thank you for coming again. And
thank you so much.
Let me give you the controls.
Share.
I would like to remind the people that are following via Facebook that you can write down your questions. So we are going to read it to Esteban at the end of his presentation.
Thank you, Christy, so much. I'm really happy to be here. It's a great initiative. I'm such a huge fan of GeoLatinas. And I think it's just very appropriate, and it's just very nice people I've met, and the connections that you do with the geoscientists in our beloved earth sciences. So I'll try to make this as enjoyable and as intuitive as possible. Like you said, I come from physics. I used to work in optics, but then I switched into the earth sciences with a little bit of applied mathematics background, and I went into and fell in love with natural dynamical systems. So what I'll try to convey today will be focused on sort of how to extract patterns and sort of spatiotemporal patterns and fundamental behavior of the dynamical system. In this case, we'll discuss the wave energy flux and how that varies across the latitudinal continental shelf of the Pacific coast of Colombia. All right, like you said, my name is Esteban Ramos Chavarriaga. I work at the hydrology of the Northern Andes research group and another group, like you said, conservation and biodiversity and evolution. I have to take a second here to thank some very important people that have given me my road and my way into the earth sciences. Juan Felipe Paniagua from EAFIT is my advisor. Juan Dario Restrepo, who many of you probably know. We don't thank him enough in Colombia for all the science that he has done, and amazing person as well. Jaap Nienhuis from Utrecht University, who is sort of our father figure in the old continent and always believes in our science, so I'm very grateful for him. And Olga Lucia Quintero, who also works in EAFIT. She's a nice, great genius and a great mentor as well. So we have been funded by the Vice Presidency of Discovery and Creation. This is my master project. I'm going to present what I've done the last couple of years. We have presented this work on the American Geophysical Union of 2020 and 2021 on the tropical coastline session and the nonlinear geophysics. We have a paper on the way, one on the archive and one on the continental shelf research. And we have everything on the GitHub, all the data and all the codes and everything is very clear there. So if you want to check it out, please do. If I have connectivity problems, let me know, please, if I freeze, so I can go back again or try to fix it. So what I will try to convey here will be divided into two parts. Part one will be focused more on the geophysics. We will try to define the wave energy flux from wave climate data. We'll use the principal component analysis and try to approach with a dimensionality reduction scheme to understand our system. And then we'll classify and cluster some of these observed regimes that we find along the continental shelf. Then we try to get some intuition on the wave-induced morphodynamics and the coastal evolution that has been happening for the last 30 years in Colombia and the Pacific coast of Colombia. Finally, to try to understand those connections with teleconnections, for example, with the ONI, with the ENSO, and understand it in terms of the climate-driven variability. The part two will be quite short, but it's on the mathematics. We'll focus on the data-driven discovery of the system of the partial differential equations. So we select a model. We have to sort of analyze our data and our system and try to extract these patterns that I was talking about. And then we try to reduce this model to make it easy to implement in any computer and try to predict statistically significant future probability states, which we will discuss at the end. And of course, the conclusions and the questions and answers part at the end. So if I want you to remember three things about this talk, and I'll start with them right away. So what we do is we develop what is called a data-driven modeling architecture. And that is based on the dominant spatiotemporal patterns of wave energy flux, which is our system, and we call it P, in watts per meter. So we're interested in those dynamics, and we want to associate them with different morphodynamical conditions of the continental shelf. So we identify three main morphodynamical regimes, which is a bit different from what was previously thought in Colombia to be two regime system. So we try to come up with the middle one that has to do with the transition in terms of sediment transport, in terms of the geological setting and all the characterizations, geomorphic characterizations that had been done previously by colleagues and professors. And we try to sort of additionally help that sort of empirical classification with supervised and unsupervised classifications. And finally, what we apply is a dynamical model algorithm with a reduced order framework, as I said, to obtain future probability states and to try to elucidate what will be the trends in future, in the probably next 50 or 100 years. So we, as I said at the end, extreme events from regional feedbacks are not fully explained by these reanalysis parameters. So we have to know our limitations, and that the main one is that our system is not measurements. It's based on a high fidelity simulation with an ensemble of a couple of models that end up adjusting sort of the behavior of the waves or the energy of the waves. So we have to be very careful with that. I want to give you a little bit of context. So this work is sort of framed into a lot of other work that has been done in Colombia, in Medellin particularly, about the Pacific coast. I'll try to show you my mouse if you can follow it. So this is a compilation of oceanographic conditions in the whole Pacific basin, and it's a very important work. There are some books written on the fluvial systems and the morphodynamics of deltas, for example, and the classification of geological characteristics along the coast. But we also try to follow some of the models that have been proposed by Ashton and Murray, for example, of instabilities in mesoscale coastal evolution. we also need to take into account all the morphodynamics of the discharging fluvial systems and the deltas, and also some other work about the spectral wave conditions. So we try to complement all this work. There's another important relevance part in Colombia is that in terms of society, we are definitely facing some threats of many vulnerable communities alongside the coast, and that have not been paid a lot of attention. So there are a couple of news that I show here. And of course, we have tectonic activity, which is a very active zone, that it's the whole Andes, of course, the subduction zone of the Andes. And we're dealing with a very steep continental shelf with a very specific characteristics of the fluvial sediment that comes into from the continent, and of course, the complex waves that arrive from the Pacific. So we are interested in understanding the basin and also the coastline. And I put this here that we need to sort of change our paradigm as well into how to convey our science to make it easy to understand, for everyone to understand, and of course stakeholders and government entities. So to give you a bit of a context, very crudely, we could separate Colombia into these natural systems. We have the Andes, of course, very complex, that divides into three beautiful and complex cordilleras. We have, of course, the Orinoquia and the Amazonia basins, which is, of course, people should know them. And we have the complex Caribbean, of course, in the Caribbean basin, but it has a depression zone, the Montesina depression, Batea. And we are going to deal here with the Pacific system, which is the one that deals with this oceanic basin and the fluvial and the basin that drains all the sediment from the Andes to the coast. So we are interested in that specific natural system. So here I show you the system, the data that we are looking at. I want to point out several things that I'll mention again later, but as you can see, we have a very non-linear system. As you can relate this shape with the points here. And what I want to point out is that we have various amount of signals. We have, of course, it appears the energy comes from the Pacific, where we definitely have some dissipation behavior. We have some other energy coming from Panama, which is the Panama jet stream from the trade winds. And we also have another thing that we call the Chocó stream. So I want to point out that this is, of course, very complex, very multi-scale phenomena, very non-linear. That means we have chaos, and we have all these properties that arise with the stochastic behavior. So we want to be very careful with that as well, and try to come up with this, or try to bring into the light these patterns, the main variabilities that are inside this sort of system. And I show you here another couple of this is an article by one of our professors. And of course, he has done a very detailed work on what are the signals that actually drive this sort of natural systems. And we have a great amount of data now that we could use from, of course, global models and defining our domain and trying to have a climatic or a hydroclimatic characterization as well of our natural system, and the signals that might influence these patterns inside our system. So what we want to do is we want to use what is famously known as the factor analysis, specifically the singular value decomposition, or people also call it the dynamic mode decomposition, or the empirical orthogonal functions. And it's just a very robust statistical decomposition of a data system. I show the best example for me is this one. When you have a phase, a picture of a phase, you can divide it into several components, into several modes. And the cool thing about this is that you can only use, you use the first of the hierarchical components, the ones that possess most of the energy, and you can use them to reconstruct most of what's going on. So that's really what we want to do here. We want to use this complex system and try to find these hierarchically important modes and try to model and understand and get physical intuition and interpretability from these particular modes. So there are a couple of examples on how they use this to understand the Niño, for example, and other signals that are into the climatic variables. We also want to use this other statistical discovery of partial differential equations, which is a very nice and robust technique, and it's very new as well. And what we do is we come up with a amount of nonlinear terms that we think might be good to define or to describe our system. So we do a regression, a very robust sparse regression in which we find which of those terms are the best ones to fit and to represent our variability. In the sense that we want to come up with a partial differential equation that we can interpret and also model quite simply into the future. So now we start with the results right away. I want to show you this diagram of this is what we call an architecture, data analysis architecture. And it's basically divided into 4 parts: a pre-processing stage, a processing stage, descriptive, data-driven descriptive analytics, and data-driven predictive analytics. So we first define our system. We use linear wave theory. We numerically solve for the wave number and then calculate the wave energy flux. Then we do some pre-processing of time series to get different behaviors that we want to point out, seasonal and multi-year. We also want to understand the Fourier components or the spectral components. And let me just, I don't know if you see my face, but I have to move my camera. And we also want to understand the anomalies. So we use the monthly mean normalization. Then we go into the data-driven descriptive analytics, which are basically just a linear regression and ANOVAs, analysis of variance. Then, as I said, we help this other empirical classification made by previous colleagues, and we try to complement those regimes that I was talking about, the morphodynamical conditions that we expect to extract as patterns from the wave energy flux. We classify them with the naive Bayes classifier and the k-means clustering. And also we use the wavelet analysis, which is just a very robust spectral decomposition of our variabilities and internal variabilities. We also want to use the coherence, so we can calculate and compute the time lag between, for example, our signal in wave energy flux and the ONI, which is the index for the ENSO variability. And finally, what I'll talk in the second part will be the algorithm to find the nonlinear terms, and then the reduction scheme, so we can have a very robust model for future state probabilities without having so much complication in the computer processing. Right, so this is just a very, I think we can go into detail later on perhaps, but this is just what normally happens when you look at waves. And if you're interested in wave mechanics, this is sort of what you will see from a wave paper, for example, a Rose diagram showing that you have very defined wave environments coming from one direction in the northern stations, but then on the southern stations, you find different waves from different directions. So we have a very complex system, of course, of swells and local wave environments. So we crudely separate from the literature the swell environments to be periods from 10 to 25 seconds. And the shorter periods will be local environments. And you can see there's a whole complex system here. We can also see it in terms of the directional, the peak direction, and we can do a statistical analysis that actually fits very well the variability in terms of how the continental shelf of the Pacific coast appears to decrease in its length and in its steepness as well. It sort of varies in a very kind of linear way. So it's very interesting, but we want to go a little deeper. And we do this principal component analysis, as I said. If you look at the patterns in the whole basin, it appears this amazing, very beautiful kind of pattern that we can start seeing, for example, some trajectories in terms of how the energy appears to be dissipating. So this is in terms of the first three principal components. And here is a very important graph when you do this decomposition, that you find that the first three principal components appear to explain almost 95% of the total variance, of the total variability. Again, the principal component in terms of the singular value shows me the same thing, that the first energy, the first components possess most of the energy, and then whatever happens later on is not very important. It's not as important as the first ones. So here you can see graphically what these modes look like in the basin. This is what the modes looks like only for the coastline stations. But then you have to, if you want to interpret what's going on, you have to look at the whole pattern in the basin. So we have this mode that appears to be from the energy coming from the Pacific. We have another mode that seems to relate with the changes of the intertropical convergence zone, for example, and the dissipation behavior, perhaps. And we used two techniques, the principal component analysis and the dynamical mode decomposition, which has a very specific difference that mathematicians will understand a bit better, but it has to do with the correlation of each mode. The dynamic mode decompositions, they are not correlated. In this case, in the principal component analysis, I know that they are uncorrelated. They are orthogonal basis. That's what it means. So what we do is we use this sort of reduced order representation of our coastal stations, and we find that the data tells us that it appears to be three different behaviors. One behavior that we observe in the south with a very wider continental shelf. Then we have a sort of a transition in between that and the two stations that are located up north, which barely have a continental shelf. They are very exposed directly to the basin. So this is what we try to model, how the energy appears to be changing from these environments in south, and then as we go up in latitude, then we find a very different behavior. So if we look at what has been previously done, the classifications, the geological classification of the natural systems, and all the characteristics, for example, of the deltas in the south, and all the barrier islands, for example, and the tidal environments that you find in the southern regime, it makes clear sense that we have a wide continental shelf with a wider zone to deposit sediment and to transport it. But then if you go up north, you find that the geology or the lithology tells you the same thing. There's just not so much sediment. It's a shorter continental shelf with, of course, the energy from the waves will hit sort of not so dissipated as would happen down south. So we corroborate these results and try to complement with our understanding. And we also, like I said, do a wavelet analysis with the components, the principal components, and the time series selected, for example, the ordinary or the anomalies. And we find the time lags to be for different events. In the Nino event, for example, in the 92, we find a time lag of days and months. But in the 98 Nino event, we also find almost yearly time lags. And it's very interesting how that changes over time. So this result is very interesting and gives you an idea of how that system correlates with climate variabilities. But again, this is not a real system, so it gives you an intuition of what we should actually be looking for in measurements, which will be one of my conclusions in a second. And now if we look at the data-driven model, this is a work that I've based on a great research group in the University of Washington, led by Professor Kotz and Brunton. And what this diagram shows us that we have a system that varies in time. So we have snapshots of that system. So we could use numerical differentiation schemes. We assume that this system changes in terms of the spatial derivatives of the spatial patterns in our system. So that's the key. We need to understand that if I want to model this variability quite simply, I have to not take into account so much the temporal variability, but more the spatial patterns in that variability. So I can sort of linearly try to model in terms of the temporal, in terms of time, I'll try to do a linear regression, but under the spatial patterns. So I'll show you what this looks like. Then I do a whole selection based on the Pareto analysis in terms of balancing the complexity and accuracy of the model. So we run several models and we see how the error changes and all of that, and we find the best one and the best non-linear terms to describe our system. Then we evaluate, of course, we use different training data sets and testing data sets. And we obtain errors of 15 for the principal component analysis and then 23% for the dynamic mode decomposition, but they clearly fit very well. So this is what I'll try to show you. If you have this kind of variability, you can see the green one appears to be the data, the real, and you have temporal variability. When you look at the evolution of the simulated system, you don't see that temporal variability, but you definitely see the spatial patterns that sort of change along the latitude. So if I use the nonlinear terms that best fit the whole system, I can go into the future and I can predict now many years from now and start seeing very interesting patterns that appear to decrease, for example, in the seasonal training data set, or in the case of the dynamic mode decomposition, some stations appear to increase quite radically. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that we can say and play with these scenarios, and this is what the work is trying to convey in the article. But very crudely, I'm going to say 3 conclusions: that we propose this architecture to identify the dominant dynamic processes driving the wave energy flux variability. We propose the 3 morphological regimes, which we connect with sediment transport metrics and geomorphical classifications. And it shows us a stable, unstable transition from north to south. That means the geoforms that we're going to find, we expect to find in the long term, in the mesoscale, in our system, in the coast of the Pacific coast of Colombia, appear to be very stable north and appear to become a bit stable as we go south. So the long-term forecast of wave energy flux in the next decades appear to be decreasing, which is very interesting and probably very important for the people who want to assess or use wave energy in the future in Colombia, that it appears to be decreasing. So this would have to be, of course, corroborated with actual results and actual measurements. So that's my final conclusion. Even though we live in an era of overwhelming amounts of data, both data scientists and data mining tools are still more available than actual measurements in most developing countries of South America, of the South American continent. So that's very important. So that's it. Thank you very much. And I hope it was clear, and I'm very happy to answer your questions. And please reach out, please.
Thank you very much, Esteban. Thank you very much. Such a really beautiful presentation. I may say I like all the graphics that you put there and how you explain it. And it's an interesting topic and a really new for me. And I don't know if somebody here in the Zoom would like to take the mic and make a question, or prefer to write in here in the chat. And meanwhile, Vanessa, is there a question there on Facebook?
There were some comments. Sorry, give me 1 second. I accidentally, my laptop closed and I got kicked out of the Zoom meeting. So I just came back like right now. So let me just see if I can pull up the chat. So I don't see any questions, but 2 people left comments. Juan Luis said, amazing, Mr. Ramos. And Marcel said, awesome modeling. And Clarette said, spectacular. So if anybody has any questions, we'd love to hear it, or any comments that you want to say, anything that you particularly were excited about. Oh, someone left in the Zoom chat, there's a question. Would you mind explaining dynamic mode decomposition again?
Yes, of course, I'll give it a try. Let me see if I can go back. Maybe here. So or I'll maybe go back even further. So when you do the singular value decomposition, which is explained sort of in this graph, that's the basis of both principal component analysis and the dynamic mode decomposition. So the principal component analysis assumes that these modes that I sort of, what this does is that I can multiply an orthonormal basis set with another sort of coefficients that would scale my variability, and now I have to multiply it by another set of temporal components, and then I get my system. So it's a matrix decomposition. But the dynamic mode decomposition goes further than that. So the principal component analysis gets to a point, and then the dynamic mode decomposition tries to compute not the patterns only by this new matrix that would be the spatial patterns if you have a spatial temporal system. This could mean anything else. It can only, it's not only, it doesn't only have to be about spatial and temporal variability. But in our case, the dynamic mode decomposition does another computation to find a best fitted U matrix or spatial components, and they are not longer orthonormal. That means that they probably could be more associated with physical processes, because physical processes are not necessarily uncorrelated. So I assume if I have very amounts of signals in my system, for example, the ONI, or the intertropical convergence zone, or the Milankovitch cycles, or whatever signals you have in any Earth system, some of them might be uncorrelated, but some of them may be also correlated. So the dynamic mode decomposition is what it tries to do is that it tries to say, no, my modes and my fundamental variability, they are not necessarily separate things. They could be correlated. They could have characteristics of one and the other. So that's the main difference. And the computation is quite simple. It's just 2 steps, maybe two computations more. I hope that's clear.
Okay. Samar said, that makes sense. Thanks.
Of course.
Anybody else want to chime in either on Zoom or on the Facebook Live?
I have another question if no one else has any other questions.
Please be my guest.
Hi, Esteban. Another question. So I really like your work. I'm wondering how you would connect this to your local communities in Colombia, right? Because as you mentioned at the end, one of your important points is that we have all these data-driven models. We have all of this machine learning that we can do. We have this stuff, but we don't have that on-the-ground data. So I'm wondering where that connection exists and how we can make that connection exist with like local communities or whatnot, or someone else who's interested in gathering the local data to be able to like compare with your modeling results.
Yes, so I think there are 2 ways to thinking your very important question, which is like the core of what I tried to say in the class conclusion. And I think there are 2 ways that we can do it. We could get the funding to go and do field work and actually measure stuff, of course, and that would be great for us data analysts. And the other thing that I try to approach here is to use supercomputers, for example, to run global climate models and do what the hard guys, the tough guys do in the States, for example, in NASA, that they run this great simulation and they run the physics, they run the fundamental models of how climate change and all the any system you want to model. And then you run and you try to do a regional analysis, a downscaling, for example, a dynamical downscaling or a statistical downscaling. And then you would have sort of better adjusted measurements of what's going on in a regional environment, in a regional local system, and try to complement, of course. There always has to be this complement between real data and observations and great models and models that allows us to bring them into local regions. And that's something that I'm barely starting to think about and starting work here at EAFIT. We're trying to use some supercomputers that we have here to run hardcore simulations on various chemical transport, or in the case if I want to run oceanographic parameters again. But as you said, we always have to complement with real data. So it's a great problem in developing countries in that sense. And I think that's sort of our work. We should, as you do, go into what a great university, for example, is doing in the States, and try to bring that knowledge and try to come up with local solutions and local analysis that could influence stakeholders in developing countries. But great question, Isa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esteban. I don't know, Vanessa, if there is another question there on Facebook.
There's not currently. I just wanted to comment that was a really extensive, great answer to the question.
I'm sorry. Yeah, you have to stop me. That's the thing with me. I try to make things as short as possible because, yeah, I could go on.
No, it's great. Okay, so Clarette has another question, or I guess one question, because she just left a comment earlier. She said, I missed part of the talk. Could you go through the main validation points of the model/workflow? Just an overview on how is the sequence of validation with calibration data? Yes. And then how do you know that the model is suitable and working as you expect? I'm going to put it in the Zoom chat just so you can make sure to hit all the points, since it's a kind of a couple questions.
I think I know where that question is trying to go. So I went there very fast because it's normally people from the earth sciences don't focus on that too much, but that's very cool. So first, I think I'll start here. So we, like I said, we have this system, and if the important thing I think from this process is that you have to have very robust numerical differentiation techniques. You have to know that if you are going to differentiate your system in time or in space, that will be a good differentiation and you get a good derivate. Because what you put then is that you have to analyze which of those nonlinear terms, which I have here, for example, just a parameter multiplied by the spatial derivative of my system, or maybe my square system derivative, or maybe the multiplication of my system by its derivative, whatever I come up with. Right, this is depending on my creativity, really, to come up with these terms. And what you do is you do a simple, what it's called a Pareto analysis, which is a complexity accuracy balance that you try to make your system as parsimonious because you don't want to overfit, of course. So the way you do that is with this graph. So you plot different models with different number of training samples, for example, and different nonlinear terms. And you try to find a point, which is the Pareto optimal, that tells you that you don't have too much complexity, you don't have many terms, you have as few terms as possible. Like I could model my system with this whole bunch of nonlinear terms. because when I do my regression, this regression, the sparse regression with different components, look, you have the answer here. You have this component and this component and this last one. So I have 3. It's not too much, but if I end up with 5, I don't want to use 5 terms to model my system. So you have to do this Pareto analysis to understand and see if, for example, only one parameter, only one of these nonlinear terms would give you a good enough error that you could predict future states. And the way you know if you have a good error is that you plot all of the errors. So if you see the R squared here, you have a bunch of models that are very good. And you see that even if you augment the number of training samples, you still get a very good error. Not in the case, for example, for a random data set. They appear to decrease as you add more complexity. So it's a very interesting analysis, and you have to go through that very carefully. So what I ended up with is only one nonlinear term. I ended up with saying my system will only be described by the spatial derivative, the first derivative of my system, and this other parameter beta that includes all the bifurcation parameters. And that's what I came up. It showed me a lot of parameters that I could use. I'm sorry, a lot of nonlinear terms, but I ended up with just one. And what I did to evaluate the system, which I think is the second question, is that you have to sort of run your model with different training data set. You train it with I trained it with 30 years from 1980 to 2000, and then I ran to 20 years, and then I ran to 2000 to 2010, the next 10 years. So if I run the next 10 years only by my model and my patterns and my nonlinear term, I get this. You can see, for example, here a bit better. This is the red line would be the predicted, and the target would be the blue line. So you see that I underestimate on the northern side, but I overestimate on the northern stations. And for a different amount of different training data set, the seasonal time series, the uniform, the ordinary, and this is what you kind of see here in these different distributions of my training data sets. So what you want to do is different kinds of model evaluations for the next couple of years, the data that you didn't use for the training. And then you see if you have good errors, for example, with the seasonal data set, with the principal component analysis, then what I do is use that model to predict into the future. And this will be, for example, this one that shows me the seasonal variability 100 years later, using the principal component analysis. And you can see that some stations appear to maintain the same variability, others appear to decrease. The last station is clearly decreasing way more than the next station. So I can say a lot about the trends that appear to tell me that my variability is kind of going down in some cases, but in other stations it appear to stay the same. You can also see it from this. This is the same model. So I hope that answered your question. You have to be very, very careful in also the evaluation, and of course the balance, the complexity accuracy balance, or the Pareto optimal, to make your model what is called parsimonious, which just means as simple as possible. It's just like the Occam razor. Yes. I hope that's clear. Please let me know.
Yeah, I think so. Let me.
Yeah, she said, I appreciate a lot the extended answers and the inspiration. Thank you. So super clear.
Of course. Thank you.
So now I will go to give you your, yeah, thank you. Your certificate. Can you see it now?
Ooh.
Yeah, it's working.
Yes, wow.
Yeah, thank you, Esteban.
No, thank you.
GeoLatinas GeoSeminars grants the certificate of appreciation to Esteban Ramos for having participated as a speaker with the topic Data-Driven Modeling of Wave Energy Flux Along Continental Shelves. The date of 10th of January.
It's February, small typo.
Oh yeah, February.
We'll fix it.
The year, it's okay. That's all that matters. It's just.
Thank you very much, Esteban, to
No,
come with
thank
us
you.
and give us this interesting presentation. And I think the good of the internet is that this video is going to still be reproducing, and maybe more people will have some questions. And I don't know if they can reach out to you by email.
Please.
Yeah. So we invite to all our followers and non-followers to follow us on YouTube channel and also in our other social medias, and where you can find also the video of Stefan talking about wave flux. And we thank you again, Stefan, and thank you all the people that came here today. And we see you next GeoSeminar.
Yes, I'll see you. Thank you so much again. It's just a very lovely time. I hope you continue and continue with this initiative. Thank you, Christy. Thank you, Isa, Vanessa, everyone.
Yeah, it was a great talk. I just wanted to highlight, Isamar said in the chat, amazing talk. I always learn something new when I hear your talks. I guess you've seen a couple of your talks.
Yes.
She's a fan already. Nice.
Thank you, Isa. No, Isa is the one who introduced me actually to GeoLatinas.
Oh, that's so nice. Thank
Yes.
you, Tamar. Thank you for bringing Esteban.
She's a big fan.
Me too. I'm a huge fan.
Oh.
A hug. Take good care of yourselves.